Good afternoon. Welcome to ADL Western Division's discussion on the California Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. I'm Tammy Gillies, and I'm the Regional Director of ADL in San Diego. On behalf of all of my Western Division colleagues, we welcome you and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We're excited to spend this next hour with you as we delve into the complicated issues surrounding California's Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. I'm pleased to note that on the call today, we have not only California participants, but participation from New York, Chicago, Las Vegas, Texas, and other parts of the country. I think this speaks to the community's concerns about this curriculum and the fact that while it may start in California, it will likely make its way to other states soon and potentially become a nationwide issue. We'll begin today with a briefing and leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. Please put any questions you might have in the chat. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you my wonderful colleague, Seth Brysk. Seth is the ADL Central Pacific Regional Director serving Northern California, Utah, and Hawaii. Previously, he was the AJC Regional Director in Los Angeles, JCRC Israel Center Director in Boston, and San Francisco Hillel Executive Director. Seth served in the Israel Defense Forces and organized Palestinian-Israeli dialogue groups. He is a former cabinet member of the American Zionist Movement, provisional delegate to the State Department Advisory Committee on Religious Freedom Abroad, and representative to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. In 2013, the Republic of Poland honored him as an Officer of the Order of Merit. He earned degrees from UC Berkeley in political science and from Tel Aviv University in international relations. I'm also proud to tell you that Seth was recently honored by ADL with our Sen Greenberg Award, honoring his professionalism and outstanding service to ADL and to the communities he serves. As you will hear, Seth and his team have been working on this issue for some time, and we are very fortunate to be hearing from him today. Thank you, Seth, and welcome.
Thank you, Tammy, for that gracious introduction. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar, and looking forward to our conversation. For those of us in the West, I hope that everyone is well, that your air quality is good or improving, and that you are safe from the devastating wildfires that are threatening many of us. But today we're going to talk about ethnic studies, and so I'm going to share my screen and we'll get going on the conversation. Okay. I hope you can see that. Okay, so we're starting with, we're going to talk about ethnic studies and in particular with regard to California for obvious reasons. The outline of our talk will include, first, why ethnic studies? Why are we talking about it? What's important about it? Why is it important in this moment? And we also have to acknowledge that we're talking about it within a broader context of rising anti-Semitism, in particular, among other forms of hate that are on the rise. Next, we'll discuss the model curriculum itself. And then finally, we'll talk about ways that you can take action. So I'll go through this as quickly as possible, although it's a lot of information. And then again, as Tammy said, to try to leave as much time as possible for discussion. So why ethnic studies? Well, first and foremost, it's important for everyone to know ethnic studies is different from other areas of study that you might encounter on the university campus. Typically, we think of universities as a marketplace for ideas, one where different ideas compete, are submitted for discussion, and then the best ideas win out. But ethnic studies is not simply a dispassionate pursuit. It has its roots in a very political environment. Ethnic studies was born in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. And in particular, it was born in California and in the Bay Area. It was the result of the longest strike in university history in the United States, first at San Francisco State and then at UC Berkeley, and led to the establishment of a Department for Ethnic Studies and a College for Ethnic Studies at both of those campuses in 1969. So it came out of a political movement. It was born because it was the result of a political act, and remains something that serves to inspire people to act in a political way. And you can see that by just a year and a half ago, there was yet another hunger strike that took place at San Francisco State University on behalf of funding and keeping ethnic studies at the forefront of the campus. Now, ethnic studies is important from ADL's perspective for a variety of reasons. As we just saw in a recent college survey about Holocaust education, there are different benefits that you can gain from studying a particular topic. Certainly, with respect to the Holocaust, there's greater knowledge about the Holocaust itself, but there are other additional benefits, like people being more receptive to differing views, willing to challenge intolerant behavior, or improving critical thinking skills. At ADL, we understand very well that the similar sorts of lessons and benefits that can be derived from studying the Holocaust can also be derived from studying ethnic studies. So it's for that reason that ADL for a long time has been a supporter of the teaching of ethnic studies. For an organization that is committed to stopping the defamation of the Jewish people and securing justice and fair treatment for all, it's important that we find ways to disrupt hate at its earliest points and disrupt bias whenever we can. And that's part of what ethnic studies offers, particularly at this moment of reckoning on social justice issues, on reckoning on issues of racism in American society. Ethnic studies offers a way to help educate people about the diverse communities in which they live and to give them understandings of different histories, cultures, ethnic groups, and the like, in order to be better citizens and more rounded. And if you think about it, it really fits in well with ADL's pyramid of hate, right? So if those of you who are familiar with ADL education understand that we believe and we know that biased attitudes are held by everyone, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit. There are a smaller number of people who will, if those biased attitudes are not challenged, may engage in acts of bias. Smaller numbers still who may engage in discrimination or violence or even genocide. So it's important to disrupt bias at its earliest moments. And that's at the heart of ADL's education work in the schools and our anti-bias programming that we do through the No Place for Hate initiative or through the World of Difference Institute. Another way of thinking about it is a famous quote by ADL's former national director, Abe Foxman, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, who said that the infamous death camp, Auschwitz, was not built with bricks, it was built with words. Words matter. Words can form opinions and attitudes. And it's because of the words and the attitudes and opinions that were formed by people who were living in Europe at the time that they would allow for their neighbors, their colleagues, sometimes their friends, to be rounded up, identified as Jews, and taken off to death camps. We saw similar things with other people who were targeted during the Holocaust. So targeting bias at its earliest point is critical. So let's talk about this moment right now. That's why ethnic studies, but why are we concerned about the ways in which anti-Semitism are covered and what goes on with respect to ethnic studies and anti-Semitism? First, let's start with a definition. Now, this seems simple enough, but anti-Semitism is a kind of hate that in some ways is different from all others. It has changed over time. It is sometimes referred to as the oldest hate. It targets Jews not only because of religion, but because of ethnicity. It targets Jews in ways that it may not necessarily target others. And anti-Semitism is sometimes cloaked in different ways. So here are some examples of ways that anti-Semitism can manifest. Now, this definition is frequently referred to as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It's one that was adopted by that organization years ago. But since that time, under the Obama administration, was adopted as a definition for looking into anti-Semitism around the world by the US State Department. It's also the definition that's used by the European Union and many of the member countries there. And more recently was adopted by the US Department of Education. The highlighted words that you see, demonizing, delegitimizing, and double standards, applies to ways in which what would ordinarily be considered criticism of Israel actually is a manifestation of anti-Semitism. And so you'll see some of these things are what are considered anti-Semitic tropes, classic anti-Semitic tropes, not necessarily modern. Ways in which Jews supposedly control or manipulate the media, the economy, or government. Ways in which Jews might be more disloyal to the country in which they live. In times in the past, that may not have included Israel because it was before Israel came to exist. So think of the Dreyfus affair, when the loyalty of Dreyfus, Colonel Dreyfus, was questioned during his trial. But today, oftentimes can manifest as disloyalty to the country in which you live and preference for Israel. Now, I stress Israel because it's one that becomes sometimes a critical point and one where there can be some disagreement. But let's be clear. There is legitimate criticism of Israel. We may disagree with it, we can argue about it, but it could be legitimate. And here you have a graphic representation of that. You have this political cartoon, which in essence is saying that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not being fair in setting the terms for negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. That is a legitimate form of criticism of Israel. Again, we may not agree with it. You may have a problem with the way that it's being formulated, but it is a discussion about Israeli policy, Israeli actions, in the ways that you would discuss any other country. On the other hand, we have a graphic depiction here of anti-Semitism, which is being masked as criticism of Israel. So here you have a very graphic picture of incident that took place in Israel, and being connected to the charge of deicide, that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus, that Jews are responsible for, in essence, killing God. This is not legitimate criticism of Israel, but rather a way to use a modern event to level an ancient charge. And what we're seeing today is an epidemic, if you will, of anti-Semitism that's going on. These are the numbers of anti-Semitic incidents that have been reported to ADL, or the ADL has discovered, over the last decade. And you can see that the last 3 years in particular have seen a sharp increase in the number of incidents. In particular, last year, 2019, saw more incidents than any other year since ADL has been tracking anti-Semitic incidents, dating back 40 years. Now, these are incidents. In some cases, they may be lawful expressions, somebody saying something anti-Semitic, writing something anti-Semitic, in addition to illegal activity. Illegal activity would be considered a hate crime. Hate that is inspiring a criminal act. And in that regard, we're also seeing some very disturbing trends. So the FBI has not released its statistics for 2019, but the most recent statistics that we have for California show that there is similarly an increase in hate crimes targeting Jews. The only reported hate crime murder in the state of California last year was that of Lori Gilbert Kay in Poway, targeted while she was at prayer in synagogue. And of course, as is consistent over time, Jews are more targeted than all other religious groups combined, and the third most targeted group of all. In fact, per capita, Jews are most likely to be targeted by a hate crime than any other group. So while we're seeing rises in hate crimes and hate being directed at different communities, we understand that this is a very serious issue. The hate that's being directed at the Jewish community is also keeping pace and in some cases outpacing those other forms of hatred. The map that you see here is from ADL's interactive hate crime map. I encourage you to look at it. It's on the website. You see the URL there. You can look at different communities, zoom in on different places, find out about specific crimes that have taken place. And of course, the hate that we measure through the anti-Semitic incidents audit does not necessarily include hate that's expressed over the internet. There's simply too much of it to track. So some of the incidents that you see here, these are aspects of Zoom bombing that have taken place during the pandemic. Some incidents of Zoom bombing, if they're not specifically directed at an individual, may not be counted in our anti-Semitic audit. Other expressions over Twitter, Facebook, and the like may not be counted unless they are specifically targeting an individual. And so here we see ways in which there are other forms of anti-Semitism that are found their way onto and proliferating over social media and the internet. Okay, so now let's talk about the model curriculum itself. The ethnic studies model curriculum is one which is born out of legislation in the California legislature. AB 331 stipulates that ethnic studies will be a mandatory semester-long course for students in California public schools. In order to make it take effect, the legislature sought to draft through the Department of Education a model curriculum. This is a document that is hundreds of pages long. In essence, it's meant to serve as a guide to teachers to enable them to be able to teach the subject. None of them necessarily are experts in ethnic studies. They may not have training in it. They may be social studies or history teachers or even English teachers. And so the guide is meant to provide them with ready-to-use lessons that they can implement in the class. AB 331, because it was specifying the mandatory teaching of ethnic studies for graduates in the state of California, was one that was supported from a very early point by ADL. And as we are not necessarily experts in ethnic studies ourselves, we did not dictate what type of curriculum it ought to be and who should be included. We simply wanted to make sure that this be taught in the classroom. Now, the first draft came out in August of 2019, and that draft was disturbing. It was taught from what's considered a critical ethnic studies point of view. It's centered around the 4 original groups. These are the groups that made up ethnic studies as part of the course of study at the Department of Ethnic Studies and the College of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State University, respectively. But then it also extended to other groups as well. And here you see the 4 original groups that were included not only in the model curriculum, but also in the university curriculum. These groups are the ones who are most considered to be worthy of having their histories, their culture, aspects of who they were taught in the classroom, because they were underrepresented in what was ordinarily considered US history and other forms of instruction. And this forms the basis of what is, again, considered critical ethnic studies. Now, critical ethnic studies, again, is more of an originalist sort of interpretation. It looks at these 4 original groups, says they ought to be stressed above and beyond others. Unfortunately, the critical ethnic studies school of thought also is a home for many people who subscribe to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement targeting Israel. This is a movement which is inherently anti-Semitic in its nature. While not all proponents or adherents of BDS are necessarily anti-Semites or are consciously practicing anti-Semitism, nevertheless, it is an anti-Semitic movement. Now, we say that at ADL because it targets those folks who are not only criticizing Israel, but seeking to delegitimize Israel, seeking to apply a double standard to Israel, criticizing Israel in the way that they would not necessarily do for other countries. When the first ethnic studies model curriculum came out in 2019, ADL spoke out because it was authored by a group of critical ethnic studies scholars. It included lessons that were not only promoting BDS as part of the lesson plan, in some of its lessons, but it also promoted anti-Jewish stereotypes. It was somewhat shocking and somewhat appalling. Moreover, there was a definition of terms in the glossary that included a number of different forms of bias and bigotry, but anti-Semitism was not among them. And so we set out a call with a number of other community groups to say that this was not right and that it needed to be changed. Almost immediately, the state responded. The sponsor of the governing legislation, AB 331, was quick to, Jose Medina, who is a member of the Legislative Jewish Caucus, was quick to pull the bill, turned it into a 2-year bill, meaning that it would delay the process for its implementation. With that delay, it allowed for changes to the model curriculum. Governor Newsom came out and said that he would not allow an ethnic studies model curriculum that degraded other groups to be issued on his watch. The state superintendent, Tony Thurmond, made similar statements, and the whole model curriculum was pulled down. There was a redraft that took place over the course of a year, and just this last July, we saw a new model curriculum issued. Now, initially, it was said that it would be limited to the 4 original groups that you see here, and this would be a way of eliminating any sort of discussion as to whether or not Israel would play a part in it, whether or not, and would allow for eliminating all of the aspects of the ethnic studies model curriculum that contained anti-Israel or anti-Semitic language. Just before there was a public comment period in July that extended into mid-August. After the written public comment period deadline had concluded, but before there was a verbal public comment period, which took place virtually over Zoom, there were some last-minute additions and changes to the model curriculum. Arab Americans and Pacific Islanders were added as 2 groups that would be part of the model curriculum that's under consideration today. Now, while it was mentioned that they would be added, there were no specific lesson plans included. In and of itself, a course that teaches about the history, culture of Arab Americans, the experiences of Pacific Islanders, is not problematic. Anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment. The sections that referenced anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment were those that came under the rubric of Arab Americans. Moreover, one of the community groups that is a proponent of including Arab Americans in the curriculum and has been tasked, we believe, with drafting the lesson plan is one that is a strong proponent of the BDS program, has been very outspoken as an anti-Zionist organization, and has put forth these as aspects of Arab American culture. So there's great cause for concern. So you see here the process involved a 30-day comment period. The 30-day comment period is actually coming to an end on September 30th, so tomorrow. And there are ways for you to be able to voice your opinion. Now, there are other models out there of ethnic studies that are very helpful to be able to look to. Here you see a guide from the LAUSD. The Unified School District in Los Angeles has put together an ethnic studies guide and includes some important guidance for teachers about how ethnic studies should be taught. And we'll see in a moment that ADL has actually cited this guide as an excellent model for the state to be able to look to. But one of the things that they teach is, thinking back to, again, the origins of ethnic studies, the LAUSD guide says that there ought to be a process by which students in the high school are simply exposed to these different narratives, to these different histories, cultures, ethnicities, without involving politics. That is something that shouldn't happen at the high school level. Rather, that type of conversation and thinking is one that is more suited for a college environment. At the high school level, we simply want to expose students to this information and teach them to think critically about the areas of study that they're engaged in. Now, there is a group out there, a coalition called the Save Ethnic Studies Coalition, that is going around from district to district, in some cases individual schools to individual schools in the state of California, urging school boards to adopt resolutions that will save or protect ethnic studies. Now, on the surface, that's a fine thing. However, one of the things that they are putting into their resolution is that they want to see the 2019 version, again, the version that included extreme anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiment in it, as used as the model and the basis for teaching in the districts. So there are some districts that have actually adopted these resolutions. In some cases, when we've spoken to those school districts, they have come to realize that they were not aware of the differences between the 2019 model and the new model that is still under consideration. And in many cases, we're simply trying to express their support for the teaching of ethnic studies. So it's important to understand that. And in fact, we believe that there are some people involved with the Save Ethnic Studies Coalition who are unaware of the political undertones of what it is that they're asking. Okay, so what can we do about it? Well, with ADL, we always want to take action. So as I mentioned, we have been writing and speaking, issuing action alerts, meeting with elected officials, contacting people throughout the process at local school districts, on the state level, and again, this action alert that you probably received most recently. The reason that is often cited for the re-inclusion of the Arab American section in the ethnic studies model curriculum this year, that is often cited, is that there were 30,000 comments that were received by the Department of Education asking that Arab Americans be included. So your voice is important and your voice needs to be heard. So what can you say and what should you do? I'm glad you asked. Here's your homework assignment, and it's due September 30th. We ask that you send an email to the California Department of Education, and here you see the email address, and that you ask for 4 things. Now, these are the same things that were included in that action alert that I just showed you. They are also included on the ADL regional websites of all of the California offices, the 5 California offices in San Francisco, in Santa Barbara, in Los Angeles, in Orange County, and in San Diego. And the points that we want you to stress are the following. If there is going to be a more broad-based view of ethnic studies in the classroom, it ought to include Jewish Americans. If it's not going to be limited to the 4 original groups, Jewish Americans also should be taught as part of this curriculum. And not only that, but it should recognize the diversity of the Jewish community. So we stress this because, for instance, one of the drafts of the model curriculum talked about how Jewish Americans and Irish Americans are very similar. At first, when they came to America, they were seen as separate. They weren't seen as genuine Americans. But since then, they have assimilated, and now they're welcomed as any other Americans. And we simply know that that's not the case. In particular, we know that extremists do not consider Jewish Americans to be white, even those of Ashkenazic descent, and in fact target Jewish Americans specifically as part of their racist rhetoric. So that's point number 1. Second, we want to ensure that there is an accurate definition of anti-Semitism in all of its manifestations. I showed you earlier in the presentation the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, which was adopted by the US State Department under the Obama administration in 2010. Again, it's used by several governments around the world and other international bodies. It reflects the breadth and depth of anti-Semitism, ways in which anti-Israel sentiment or supposed critiques or criticism of Israel are actually masking anti-Semitism. This is important, as well as, of course, Holocaust denial being a form of anti-Semitism. So an accurate definition of anti-Semitism is critical for students to be able to have a good understanding of the topic. But we don't want to see it left to chance. So we want to see inclusion of lessons about anti-Semitism itself. And of course, ADL has several lessons that we can offer. There are 8 that are listed in one of the letters that I showed you prior that are on, again, all of the California regional ADL websites. 8 different lessons that we have on anti-Semitism, including lessons that meet Common Core standards. In addition, ADL is about to release a single anti-Semitism unit that will be issued digitally so that we can reach over 1,100 school districts across the state of California and be able to meet all of their needs. So inclusions of lessons about anti-Semitism, and of course taught by an authoritative voice on anti-Semitism like the ADL. And lastly, we'd like you to ask for transparency and the opportunity for public comment in all phases of the development of the final ethnic studies model curriculum. So we mentioned this because, again, in August, we submitted our letter on the 11th. The public meeting took place on the 13th. On the night of the 12th, that's when the Department of Education issued this addendum that said that it would add an undefined course on Arab Americans and Pacific Islanders to the curriculum. So it was too late for us to comment in writing publicly. And unless you were able to log into the discussion that day, and there was a strict time limit and not all voices were heard, then objections to that were not able to be heard. So public comment ends September 30th on this phase. There will likely be another round of public comment on a reviewed and revised version of the ESMC that will take place sometime in November and December. ADL will certainly let you know, and we will send out action alerts about this so that you know when to comment and what some of the issues might be. But your voice is important. So please take down the email address, take down these points, or reference them on the ADL websites in your region, and let your voice be heard. Thank you. I look forward to engaging with you in questions and discussion.
Thank you, Seth. That was a lot of great information there and a lot to take in. So I just want to remind everyone, all of our participants today, that we will be recording this. It's going to be sent to you. You can feel free to share it. We're also going to send you all the links that Seth has talked about in his presentation, along with the addresses, email addresses of your local ADL offices for additional questions if you have them. So let's get to some of the questions because there are so many and they are really very good. So I'm going to try to pull them all together into something that makes sense to the group. Okay, so I want to back up just for a moment because I got a couple of questions, Seth, on the map and the hate crimes data that you were speaking about. And people are wondering where we get that data, how it's compiled.
Sure. So the hate crimes data is compiled primarily from the FBI. The Department of Justice issues a hate crimes report every year on the prior year's incidents that they've received from various law enforcement agencies around the country. Now, one of the things I didn't say is we know, and it's been documented, that hate crimes are traditionally underreported, vastly underreported. There are somewhere between 80 or 90 communities, law enforcement agencies around the country that, and cities of a population of over 100,000 that report either 0 hate crimes occurring in their jurisdiction, or they simply do not report at all. And we also know anecdotally that there are people who have said to us that they don't report a hate crime, perhaps because they are concerned about their immigration status, or perhaps because they think it's not a big deal, I'll just clean up the graffiti, I'll just move on, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to cause a fuss. Or maybe they're scared about retribution. So that hate crimes data that we have on our map comes from the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, but the numbers that I cited today for 2019 came from the California Department of Justice that was issued by the Attorney General in California.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I know when we talk about hate crimes that they are very much underreported, and so we're looking more at the trends than the actual numbers, and we see the trends, the anti-Semitism going up these past several years. So people are wondering about their own local school boards, and how does this curriculum or what have you impact in the local school board? Should they be addressing some of their concerns to their local boards? And what do you see as the process of that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is very much a local issue. As I mentioned, this is a model curriculum. So it's meant to be one that can be used wholesale by any teacher who is tasked with teaching the subject of ethnic studies. But it's not mandated that this is the curriculum that be used. So on the one hand, the curriculum will be very influential. Certainly a number of teachers will use it as it is and use it in the classroom. Not only in California, of course, but similar to other districts. Look, my children are learning math. They have math worksheets that say the state of New York's Department of Education. So frequently, large states or well-funded departments of education will be used as a model or as a basis for teaching across the country. So we believe that this is going to happen here. Just like ethnic studies started at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley, and now there are departments across the country at Ivy League schools, public universities, other private institutions across the country. Certainly we think this is going to happen in high schools across the country as well. So it is up to individual districts to see fit how they will institute the teaching of ethnic studies. And that means that they could very well go back to the 2019 model and use that model, which includes that anti-Israel sentiment. They could mandate other aspects of the teaching of ethnic studies. So it's important for you to monitor, to be aware of what's going on in your individual schools and in your individual school districts. As I mentioned, there are over 1,100 of them in California. And we track them as best we can. We comment to them as best we can, but it's also you have a part to play in this as members of the community.
Yeah, that's really an important piece. And so I think we'll all be tracking that in our own regions, and we can certainly use help with that. We understand that the governor has signed California Ethnic Studies a bill that allows the CSUs to move forward with this, and we're wondering what the difference is between what we're talking about today, the K through 12 or the high school, and the Cal States.
Right. So these are two different issues. I'm glad you brought this up, Tammy. So the bill that was just signed into law, I believe it was AB 1460, was a bill that mandated the teaching of ethnic studies as a requirement for graduation from the CSU campus. So any of the Cal State universities now, for people who will seek to earn a degree, you will have to take as a requirement, along with some of the other courses that are required, a course in ethnic studies. This is separate and apart from the ethnic studies model curriculum that we're talking about here. This is the one that I was just talking about, was a semester of ethnic studies taught at the high school level. Now, the Cal State University Ethnic Studies course, there was some controversy. The university system itself adopted a plan for implementation. Although it included Jewish studies and considered Jewish studies as part of ethnic studies, it also allowed for the teaching of social justice courses that would qualify for graduation. The bill that was signed by the governor, and the law will not include Jewish studies, but will also not include social justice courses. Now, we did not take a position on that bill, and the reason being that, on the one hand, including Jewish studies is a positive thing. On the other hand, a social justice course could certainly be a course that encourages people to go out and speak out on issues of concern, like, for instance, to support BDS. So we liked one aspect of the CSU plan, but we didn't like one other. And of course, on the state, when the state bill came through, it did not include Jewish studies, but it also, on the positive side, did not include social justice courses. So for that reason, we remain neutral. And you can see there's a division within the community. There were Jewish studies professors from various CSU campuses who disagreed. Some who felt that they wanted to support the CSU's bill proposal, some who wanted to support the bill that was making its way through the legislature, and others who wanted to remain neutral. And so for that reason, ADL remained neutral. But again, it's all about local implementation. So it will be critical for people to be aware, for students who are in the university to know what is in their course curricula, and to report it to an agency like ADL if they are encountering some form of bias or bigotry.
And I think I'll add that there's potentially another layer of complication where in some high schools, they can take college level courses to satisfy their graduation requirements. And so are they taking something out of a university that's different than what we're promoting for in the high schools? So is there a way to address that, or is it monitoring that's the best approach?
Well, the monitoring is the best approach, but again, if that is the case, one thing to be aware of is that at the university level, politics often finds its way into the course of study in ethnic studies. And as we talked about with the model curriculum that's at use in LAUSD, and also with a set of principles that was adopted by the legislature on AB 331, on the bill that mandates the teaching in high schools, they talked about making sure that politics is not included in the classroom in the high school level, that it would be not permissible to disparage groups on the basis of religion, national origin, ethnicity, et cetera, as part of the teaching of ethnic studies. So if a student is taking an ethnic studies course at a university level, it may be in violation of that, and therefore, technically, conceivably, might not qualify under the state law. So again, it's important for people to monitor what's being said, to consider that, and to report it to an agency like ADL so that we can help you advocate on your own behalf.
Very interesting. I have a question that is, I'm putting you on the spot here because I know that we can actually do an entire separate webinar on this one, but I want to put it out there because I think it's important. We have someone who is asking us if you can be pro-American Jews and anti-Zionist, or is that an oxymoron?
If you can be, I'm not sure I understand the question, but if you can be pro-American Jews
Right.
and anti-Zionist.
Yes.
Well, look, I suppose one could say, let me back up. Zionism is the right to self-determination for the Jewish people. Jews are a people, like any other. And all people, according to international law, are afforded the right to self-determination. For the Jews, that right to self-determination is Zionism, manifested as the state of Israel. If you say that Jews have no right to determine their own political future, then you are seeking to deny a basic right guaranteed under international law. That means that all people, again, all people have a right to self-determination. So conceivably, it's possible that you would be somebody who subscribes to a belief that there should be no nation states, that there ought not to be nations that divide human beings from one another. And I suppose in that regard, you wouldn't be being biased because you believe that no people should be asserting themselves as an independent political entity. But barring that, it's likely that if you are opposing Zionism, that doesn't mean that you have to necessarily want to move to Israel yourself, or that you see that all Jews should move to Israel. But if you say that Zionism is illegitimate, if you oppose the concept of Zionism, what you are doing is you're trying to deny the right of another group of people self-determination. So if that's the case, and if it's only the Jews, then you are distinguishing in a biased way the Jews from other people. And therefore, it's an expression of anti-Semitism. Let me just say one thing further. Anti-Semitism comes in many forms, just like other forms of bias and bigotry. There are ways in which it can be expressed that are that do not necessarily dictate that you want to cause harm to another person. You may be doing it unintentionally, but nevertheless, it still is a form of bias or bigotry. And so there are some people, similar to people who support BDS because they think it's a nonviolent way of addressing the conflict. There may be people who say they oppose Zionism, thinking that they are engaging in a political discussion and not realizing that what they are actually advocating for is a form of discrimination against a group of people.
You said that very well. I think that's awesome. And again, I think we could do a whole webinar just on some of those issues. So we have some folks that are participating today that have students in their schools that are already taking ethnic studies classes. And so what are the red flags that they should be looking for as we're asking folks to monitor? Are there certain things that really stand out that we should be looking for?
Sure. I mean, certainly if there may be some ways in which it's very overt, the expressions that are biased against different groups. So we saw, for instance, lyrics to a song that were proposed as part of the 2019 draft that were explicitly and very extremely anti-Israel. So there may be ways in which it manifests in that way. But perhaps an easier way of thinking about it is ethnic studies is a course of study that's meant to teach about the various experiences of different ethnic groups in America. So if the course involves discussions about international affairs, politics that are outside of the shores of the United States, if it doesn't talk about the culture, the history, the experience, the language of different groups, their immigration, their acculturation, their assimilation, their struggles, here in America, then there is potential for bias because now you've gone beyond what is considered the realm of ethnic studies and you're getting into other areas. So I think it's important, you'll notice when we talk about, for instance, talking about the Jewish American experience, there's not really anything in there about Jews and connections to Israel per se. There is a wholly legitimate, rich history and story to be told about Jewish Americans, as there is with Latinx Americans, with Latinx community, with African Americans, with Asian Americans, with Native Americans, with Arab Americans, with Pacific Islanders, with whichever group you want to cover. There is a lot to be taught and to be said that can be limited to the experience that's here in America. And that is really ought to form the core and the basis for ethnic studies.
Seth, you've given me a great segue because there's a question that I want to read and it's come up in several different ways. So the participant is asking us that ethnic studies has a historical link to the racialization of working class struggles and under-resourced communities. Are American Jews a part of the working class struggle? Are they an under-resourced community compared to other racialized groups? And in what concrete ways are American Jews subordinated as a socioeconomic group that constitutes contemporary economic systemic oppression? I know that's a lot, but I have to say that I think this is the actual reason. The fact that this question is coming up from several participants in different ways is the reason that we need this ethnic studies. So I'm going to ask you to address a little bit of that.
Sure. So look, it's important because I think this sort of gets to the root of the lesson plan that I alluded to before about Jewish Americans and Irish Americans. So for many, most, if not all Jewish Americans, their experience coming to America was informed by the kind of experiences that were alluded to in that question. Certainly today, Jews have attained a level of privilege and accomplishment where you would not ordinarily think of most of the community in that way, or certainly as in the community as a whole in that way. But nevertheless, there certainly are members of the Jewish community who are denied certain rights, are certain opportunities, or experience bias or bigotry in certain ways. Again, aspects of teaching ethnic studies is about the oppression of different groups, the ways in which different groups' stories have not necessarily been told. So taken from the current lens that we have, most people, if you ask them about Jews or their experience of who the Jews are, they would simply think of Jews, as that lesson plan on Irish Americans, Jewish Americans did, as white Americans. Not only white Americans, but extremely successful, privileged white Americans. Well, that's a misunderstanding and a misreading of who Jews are. First of all, that's not who we have traditionally been. That's not the history that we came to this country with. That's not the struggle, the oppression that we overcame to attain the level of achievement that we have today. Second of all, that's not who Jews are. There are 15% or so of the Jewish community that are people of color. over half of the Jews worldwide are people of Middle Eastern and North African descent. And so the Jewish story is a much broader and richer experience. And today, one can still easily argue that the United States of America is, while we aspire to be a country where we have the separation of church and state, there's still many aspects of American society and American culture which tend to favor, don't favor the Jews. So those are all important aspects of the Jewish American experience and the Jewish American story, which necessitate teaching about it in the classroom.
Really well said, Seth. And I would just add that, here in San Diego, in the community of La Jolla, up until very recently, so in modern history, there were no Jews allowed to buy homes in La Jolla. And CCNRs from the neighborhoods would say, no Blacks, no Jews, or no Negroes, no Jews. And this is a modern history that our students are not being taught in the schools. So I think it is important to understand all people's history and how they've come to this country. And I think there are ways of doing it non-political. And going back to the survey around Holocaust education, that any type of education that's fair in this way allows us to see each other as not just the other, but to understand the history and the struggles of what all immigrants and indigenous peoples and the Black community that was brought here not of their own will. Everyone has had struggles, some more than others, but the more we understand, the better our next generation is going to be, I think.
That's right.
So as we are sending out information, I know you're going to give us talking points, things that we can do with our homework to send. Is this also something we should be sending up to Governor Newsom, or is it just to the ethnic studies address?
Well, I think it will be important to send it to Governor Newsom. The governor still has not yet signed AB 331 into law. This is the bill that will mandate the teaching of ethnic studies as a course for high school students for a semester. So he is still open to persuasion about the bill, about whether or not he issues some sort of signing statement, whether or not he may try to attach some sort of caveats. Certainly, he may also be free to veto the law at this point. So I would think that including the governor in your communications would be important. But again, for the purposes of the model curriculum itself, that is being drafted by people within the Department of Education. And so that's why we ask you that you address it to them. They're the ones who will determine the specifics. The governor's office will not get into the nuts and bolts of what types of lesson plans will be included, what types of definitions might be used, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why we ask you to target the Department of Education.
Great. And you've mentioned a few times that it's public comment. Is there somewhere that we can actually see what people are sending in, and or is that just, when we say public comment, is that just for the Department of Education to see?
Well, it's inviting the public, it's finding the comment of the public. So it means that everybody is allowed to offer their input. There are ways, I believe, on the CDE website where you can find some of the comments that are being made. And again, there will be sessions like the one that took place in August where people can sign up to, I mean, ordinarily you would do this in person, but of course we can't due to social distancing. So they've been having virtual public comment periods where people are allowed to offer oral comments as well. Again, we anticipate there will be a 45-day public comment period in November, after there is a redraft based on the public comment that ends on September 30th. So there will be, not only in the next 36 hours, an opportunity to offer public comment on the current draft, but also another opportunity later on this year to offer second public comment. And again, stay tuned to ADL for information about that what the draft looks like, where are the areas for improvement that we see.
Is that draft available to the public to view?
Yes. The draft is, as I said, I think it's over 500 pages. We've been reading through it and looking at it. It includes also appendices that add some specific lesson plans and references. And that draft is public and it is available on the California Department of Education website.
Well, that 500 pages plus, I know that you and your team have been reading through diligently every time another draft comes out. So I thank you for all of the great information. Seth, we're going to be providing that to everyone who gave us an email address. And we hope that you'll come back and we can do this maybe after, as we go in towards the end of the year in the next session of public comment.
Be happy to do it. Thank you, Tammy. And
Great.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today.